Hello, everyone. Welcome to our weekly chats. Thanks again for joining me today. Again, I know a lot of you come in later, so thank you for your comments, regardless if you're live or you're coming in later on watching us on repeat, so to speak. Um, I got getting a couple great questions, either through this page or through my job at the historian's office. Um, and keep them coming. They're great questions. And one of them is someone had asked me why I have the Wizard of Oz behind me, and we're going to talk about that in a couple weeks. Actually, I actually this room that I'm in is my home office, and it also doubles as some other things. Um, in addition to like storage room and bunch of things. But I've always liked The Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz has been an intriguing story for me. But there's actually for a lot of people, I'm sure, but there's a lot of political history in the Wizard of Oz, and also there's an East Aurora connection to the Wizard of Oz. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit in the coming weeks. A very fascinating connection to the Wizard of Oz here in East Aurora. So that's the answer to one question that's coming in a couple weeks. And one of the suggestions someone had made was talking about women's history. This is Women's History Month. March is Women's History Month. And a lot of times when we talk about women's history, we talk about particular accomplishments of women, of particular women. You often see biographies and highlights of women, and we'll do that. We can do that. But one of the other parts of women's history that I don't always see a lot of, and with these themed history months as well, a lot of times we focus on the people, individual people, the heroes of movements, things like that. People have accomplished things within those movements. Um, and so women's history, a lot, we would talk about Alice Hubbard. We'd talk about the first woman to do things. But also there were things in women's history, political decisions, political movements that aren't just based on one person. And I find those fascinating. And one of the things, so in response to the suggestion that we talk a little bit about women's history, was a couple years ago I had done research well, first of all, I did research into women's suffrage here in East Aurora, and I have a whole presentation that I do about it. And I actually talked a couple weeks ago, or actually it's a couple months ago now, on one of these live talks about women's suffrage and the history of it here in East Aurora. And uh, that was meant to be, I had put together exhibits and a presentation for the anniversary in 1920 of women's suffrage nationwide. And then, of course, COVID happened. And so those efforts kind of got bumped back. Out of that research that I had done, was I discovered that after researching women's right to vote, and how that was gained in New York State in 1917 and then nationwide through constitutional amendment in 1920, that a lot of times we end our discussion of women's history or women's suffrage there, right? Uh, Women got the right to vote, everything's fine, right? They get the right to vote, they can run for office. But I soon discovered that there were a lot of things that were left behind, and there was still shockingly debate about. And one of those things was women serving on juries. And this became a debate in the 1930s. And it appears that somebody or groups of folks realized that women still in many areas, including New York State, could not serve on juries. And one would think that if this oversight were brought up, that the legislatures would say, "Oh, yeah, we of course women can vote now, so they should be able to sit on juries. That just makes sense, right?" But there was resistance, and there was actually a huge debate in the 1930s, even here in East Aurora, over whether or not women should be able to sit on juries, which fascinated me. So, on one hand, women were give, granted the right to vote in 1920 nationwide, but then, you know, they were that still just didn't mean that they could get all these other rights that just seemed to go hand in hand. I from our modern perspective, we would think, oh, if women could be given the privilege and the right to vote, they should also, be capable of serving on a jury. So what precipitated this was this article that I saw in a local newspaper, and I think it was a Buffalo newspaper, and they did one of these sort of roving reporter things and roving photographer things. And this is a good example of when you have those old newspapers that you maybe keep for the headlines on the front, the day Kennedy was assassinated or the moon landing. Look in the. It's great to keep those original papers and that everybody is attracted to the headline and the front page. That's what draws all the attention. But if you open up the back of the newspaper, you'll find out things about daily life that you may not have otherwise noticed. And this was one of those cases. And I was reading or maybe researching something totally different, and this caught my eye, and it just fit into my research about women's suffrage. And the question was, do you think women should be eligible to sit as members of juries in New York State, and why? And it was a pretty split decision. There were responses on both sides of the issue, but I found it fascinating. And I'm just going to read some of the responses. Again, the question was, do you think women should be eligible to sit as members of juries in New York State, and why? And this was in 1930. So this is 10 years after women's suffrage, and this issue was coming back up in political debate. And a woman responded, no, the woman's place is in the home. There will be happier homes, and fewer divorce cases would result if the woman kept her place as mother and homemaker. A great majority of the jury cases are not fit for a woman to listen to, much less act upon. Another female response, another woman, said yes, women should be allowed to serve on juries. It's one of the obligations and privileges conferred along with citizenship. Women are as capable as men in deductions, reasoning, and impartial decisions, especially in trials of cases involving their own sex. So a case involving a woman would be a better juror, according to this response. A male response to that question, a man responded yes, because they probably would average higher in intelligence than men who now monopolize this function of citizenship. Another male response, sure, give it to them if they want it, but why would they want it? That's an interesting response. A woman responded, well, I don't think a married woman should. She has enough work to do in her own home, although I believe married women should have interests outside the home. So basically, this woman was saying women should have interests outside the home, but jury duty is not one of them. And then finally, a male response, quote, as a general rule, the proper place for a woman is taking care of the family because women are more even-tempered and cool-headed. A lot of women, however, would be better jurors than men, in my opinion, but most women would not be sufficiently strict on criminal cases because of their naturally sympathetic nature. So those were the responses to this roving reporter uh, newspaper report, and so that opened a can of worms of research for me. Um, in the mid 1930s, I discovered that half of the U.S. states still deem women unqualified to serve on juries, and New York State was one of them. But there was a push in the 1930s to allow women to serve on juries, not make it an obligation, but allow them. And there was this big debate about it, and it's interesting some of the reasons why people didn't think, women especially, a lot of women didn't think women should be on juries, but the reasons why. In addition to the nonsense biological reasons, but they would say that women needed to be home with the children, but that was making an assumption that all women were mothers. And all women were mothers of children who had to be at home. So, children who, were in school or grown up, so a retired woman, they just put all women under this category that they needed to be home, which lends itself to the idea that that wasn't the real reason people didn't want women on the juries. It was discrimination. But they were coming up with reasons to say why women shouldn't be on juries. Another one of the more fascinating reasons, though, is Time Magazine actually had a report of this. So this wasn't just a local debate, but Time Magazine had a discussion of should women be on juries, and leading attorneys groups, lawyers associations, came out against women being on juries, not because of the decisions they would make or that they wouldn't be able to handle some of the um, uh, evidence, maybe in the more sensitive cases or maybe murders, things like that. But it was because they were concerned that male lawyers, so most of the lawyers, nearly all of them were men, couldn't relate to jurors, and the judges couldn't relate to the jurors. So they couldn't come, when they were formulating their arguments, if the lawyers couldn't relate to, half the jury potentially, that would impact their case. So it wasn't necessarily the juror that was the problem. It was the lawyers having the inability to communicate with women. And they came right out and said that. And I'm just trying to see if they're, yeah, uh, attorneys groups fought the idea, and this is what I wrote in my research, in the early 1930s because lawyers had, quote, difficulty in talking to women jurors. Um, so that just was fascinating to me. So this debate went on for a while, and actually, the reason why I bring this up as a local history item is that uh, in 1937, New York State actually, 1937, May of 1937, New York State passed legislation that allowed women to serve on juries. And it became effective the next September. So May 1937 and September 1937, women could start serving on juries. However, unlike men who were who were forced, it's their duty, it's their citizenship duty to serve on a jury, women could opt out. Actually, it wasn't opting out, it was opting in. So you, as a woman, would not be called for jury duty unless you had signed up for it, which is interesting. So you didn't have to prove that you couldn't serve on a jury or you shouldn't be able to serve on a jury. You had to actually volunteer. So uh, in the East Aurora Advertiser, the local newspaper, in April of 1938, um, they were trying to figure out a way to get women. How were we going to get women to serve on juries? Now that it was a brand new thing, they were allowed to serve on juries. But the local officials asked, so a commissioner of jurors, so to speak, asked women to contact their town office, um, where the town clerk would keep track of all the women who are interested in serving on a jury. And because so many women didn't, the idea was that so many women didn't want to serve on a jury, that it would have been easier um, for the town to send the list in of the women who wanted to rather than the other way around. So the county had asked for a list of women to serve on juries, and the town decided, well, it's much easier for us to just send the list of the women who want to serve. So they went along with that, and so you actually had to sign up as a woman to serve on jury duty. And you can see the problem with that. Even today with jury duty, as much as most of us hopefully feel that it's an obligation, part of our duties as a citizen, we kind of get upset when we get the notice, right? It's not convenient for anybody. So that would lead to a problem if you were to sign up for jury duty. So not a lot of women probably would have signed up for jury duty. It's a right they maybe believe they should have, but life happens for everybody, and they may not have had um, uh, the interest in serving on a jury. So that led to problems. So the jury pool still skewed toward men. And the idea of allowing women to serve on juries was that the argument had been made to the legislatures, to the courts, that you don't get a fair trial if you don't have women on it. And that's true. That's certainly true. Um, and imagine especially female defendants in a case, or even the civil cases. You have cases going to courts in civil cases where people are suing each other, that men don't have a monopoly on being a juror on that. So they actually made a push to get women to not refuse jury service and to opt in. And actually, one of the other reasons this is interesting from a local history standpoint is that in 1938, so in the spring of 1938, after this had been implemented, Assistant District Attorney, and she goes by the name of Winifred Stanley, and the reason she's important is she was Erie County's first female prosecutor. She came to East Aurora, and she came to a meeting of the Mothers Club that month. And the Mothers Club was, it is what it says. It was a group of local mothers. Um, and she came to a meeting and she said that she is urging women to sign up because she said a true cross section of the community could not be represented if women were not on juries. And so that it was, even though you weren't legally obligated to sign up to be on jury duty, women should morally feel obligated as citizens to sign up. And she said that women should, particularly mothers. So this was she was honing in on the mothers from at the Mothers Club, should want to serve on juries to make the world a better place for children. She said they know children, they know the problems uh, of buying things and the household budget. Women and mothers in particular have a particular skill set that would make them great jurors. That was her claim. Um, so that was the push to get women to serve on juries in the 1930s. However, it was still optional for many more decades, and as a matter of fact, even in 1961, and I was intrigued to find this out, the Supreme Court upheld a Florida law that allowed women to just opt into jury service. And they said this, the Supreme Court said, because a woman is still regarded as the center of the home and family life, that they should not be obligated to leave that home and family life and go serve on a jury. So they didn't have to opt into jury service. So they were basically making housekeeping and motherhood as not a job, essentially, as a man would have. And they were making this assumption that all women, regardless of whether or not they had children at home or responsibilities, even though all women aren't, don't have all the same responsibilities. And at this point, you could have had teachers, you could have people working in banks, things like that. Women weren't all at home, and some, like I said earlier, were retired. So they were painting with this very broad brush and saying that women could opt out just because of that. And it's interesting because, those reasons, the fact you have to take care of someone at home or you're a caregiver, those are still reasons that you can get exempted from jury service, conflicts of interest, things like that. But being a woman isn't the reason. A man could have those conflicts as well. So they were equating a whole bunch of conflicts with someone's gender, someone's sex, and they weren't all one and the same. But that was still in 1961. Um, Finally, in 1979, the Supreme Court, another case came forward. A Supreme Court ruled that opt-out policies for women were unconstitutional. And they said that defendants could not get a fair trial unless the jury was a cross section of the community, a cross section of their peers, and the only way to do that was to make sure women were included. So that put an end to that. But 1979, and I think a lot of us lose. I was alive in 1979, so when I was born, there were still places in this country where women did not have to serve on a jury and they were treated differently in that respect. So when we think about women's suffrage, we often forget all the stuff that happened after that, and some of these debates that were still going on. Unbelievably, um, in my opinion, in 1979, and of course that's part of the women's liberation movement, and there were things being discovered in our laws that were not equal. We celebrate 1920 and women being able to vote, but we forget that there were all sorts of laws that were either not discovered yet, or they just kind of were there and part of society, and nobody even thought about it until it came up as an issue. Women serving on juries being one of them. Um, and it's unbelievable to me that that you had to still fight to get this right, and responsibility. Now, again, many women may not have wanted to serve on juries, but if you were a man in this situation too, the men should be arguing for equality as well for serving on juries. You want a cross section if you're accused of a crime or you have a civil lawsuit. You want a cross section of the community, and I think some of the arguments that this assistant district attorney, Winifred Stanley, made were good ones. The perspective of mothers and women um, are just as important as the diverse perspective of men. And basically, the arguments were valid, slow but sure, that women could not be disqualified from jury service simply because they're a woman. That there may be other reasons to disqualify them from jury service, but being a woman in and of itself does not make you an unfit juror. And today, of course, we think, oh, that's of course, but just in 1979, there were people still arguing that women should not serve on juries. So I found that quite fascinating. Another area that came up out of this, and we forget this too, and this was part of my research when I was looking into the Bank of East Aurora, which opened 100 years ago in February this last month, and I did my monthly article about it. Um, uh, and this grand building was built on Main Street, and there was a huge hoopla over the grand opening of it. So there's a link to the article in a previous post here if you want to look it up. Uh, Fascinating story in and of itself of the 1920s and big buildings and excess, the Roaring Twenties, and how the banks, they wanted people to come to the bank not necessarily because they were a good bank, but because of the grandeur of the building and the security of the building. The only word I could think of was, the word that epitomized what I was reading and what I was researching was excess, that everything was grand and bigger than it maybe needed to be. Part of that research, part of the story of the Bank of East Aurora, which is today an event venue converted from the old bank called the Bank. Um, One part of that was they opened as a part of the bank a women's room, and they called it a restroom, but not necessarily a toilet facility, but a room where women could go, and they had lounge chairs, they had a desk, a separate area for women to go and when they visited the bank. And they advertised this into the 1930s, the Bank of East Aurora. Come to our bank. Women will be welcome here, and women will be able to have a safer, calmer place to go do their banking and to rest if they need to, sort of to attract women customers. I found this quite ironic because most banks wouldn't allow women to open up their own bank accounts, or take out a loan or do any banking essentially, without their husband's permission or with another male who would co-sign, a brother if you were a single woman. In rare instances, they didn't have to. There are a couple cases in East Aurora that I know of where women probably could get their own bank account, but in most cases, women had to have a co-signer, a husband, a man. And that was the case until the 1970s, even into the 1980s, I believe. My mother told me the story that she couldn't get a credit card without my father's signature. Women could not get their own bank accounts in many cases for much of the 20th century. So it was really ironic to me that the bank was advertising this special room, restroom for women to come do their banking, while I'm assuming the bank and most banks wouldn't allow women to open their own bank accounts because for the variety of reasons that women weren't treated the same way, and they couldn't be trusted or had the resources to open their own bank account. And there's a great episode of All in the Family that I point to a lot when I talk about this. Edith wants to buy Archie, I believe, a gift, but she didn't want Archie to know about it. So she goes to the bank to try to get a loan or to open a bank account in order to fund this gift, to get this gift. And the bank would not allow her to open the account or get the loan without her husband's signature. And of course, that's a dilemma because she didn't want him to know about it. And of course, in our heads, we're like, well, how is this possible? We must be talking about ancient history. A woman couldn't open a bank account, when in fact it was just a generation ago. Quite, um, quite fascinating. So again, these things that we focus a lot of times on 1920 and women gaining the right to vote, but then we forget that there are other issues: women serving on juries, being able to open bank accounts, that followed for decades after that. And it happened right here in East Aurora too. We weren't exempt from this discrimination that was going on with women jurors and women opening their own bank accounts. So I found it really fascinating, this part about women serving on juries. Now, another interesting thing that I found is that this assistant DA came to push women to encourage women to sign up to serve on juries, and she came to the Mothers Club. And what I found fascinating is the Mothers Club. As I was looking through a lot of the old notices in the newspaper of their activities, and a lot of their activities were the encouragement of women staying in the home, not necessarily going out and serving on juries or running for political office, things like that. So I found it fascinating that this woman, this assistant DA, was brought in to speak to the women's club, the Mothers Club, which in Women's Club, to encourage them to serve on juries, something that maybe was contradictory to what the club may have done earlier, and how they may have evolved into a different type of thinking. And that there had to be an actual effort in the community to go. The assistant DA had to go to civic clubs around the county to encourage people to sign up to serve on juries. So it wasn't just the law changing, there was actually a political, social effort to get women to sign up to be part of jury duty, so it wasn't as simple as it sounds. Yes, after many, many years, in 1937, they changed the law, and women all of a sudden could serve on juries. No, there was a real big effort to get women to step forward, to change the thoughts and minds of people. Because the more women jurors you would have, the faster you would be able to change the attorneys' minds. These male attorneys who said they would have trouble communicating with women jurors, their minds would probably be changed if they started communicating with women jurors, and discovered, well, no, our thought process was wrong, that it's not difficult to discuss a case with a woman juror and to convince them of your arguments, that they were that reason was unfounded. So the only way to do that was to get women to sign up. The idea was there, but you had to actually implement it in order to change minds, and it takes a long time, as any movement like this does. So that's the discussion of women jurors, and I was both surprised and appalled that it took so long, and the timeline of it all. But again, you learn something new every day, and it was certainly something that I had not thought of until I had delved into the research. So I'm glad to share it with you. Some cool stuff I'm working on. A couple people had asked, one person in particular had asked me what kind of research I'm working on today, actually. As much as I love having these weekly chats, I'm taking a break from some research into a murder in East Aurora, actually a couple murders that are linked together. And stay tuned for that, because I kind of fell onto this story. And the more I dig into the archives and research, the more fascinating it's getting. And it's bigger than East Aurora, and the court case is really fascinating. So anyway, stay tuned for that. and you never know what you're going to find in newspaper archives. So always dig for that. So thanks again for joining us for this discussion. And if you have any ideas, comments, questions, please send them along. I'd love to hear your feedback, especially later this month if we want to talk more about the role of women, women's history. I'd be glad to do that if you have any ideas. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.